The rain had begun long before anyone in the village noticed. Sheets of cold, relentless water streaked across the narrow streets, soaking the cobblestones and sending rivulets racing into the gutters. In the dim glow of a flickering lamppost, a small figure huddled beneath the tattered awning of an abandoned bakery. His coat, thin and worn, did little to protect him from the night, and yet he remained perfectly still, as if he had been waiting for this storm all his life. Nobody knew his name, and more importantly, nobody cared. He was an orphan, a shadow among shadows, drifting through a town that had learned to ignore those who had nothing to offer. But in the silence of that storm, there was a glimmer, an unspoken promise that this boy carried something the world was not yet ready to see. By morning, the streets would be littered with remnants of the storm, broken branches, mud-streaked laundry, and the lingering scent of wet earth. Yet amidst the chaos, the boy would vanish as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind nothing but a faint footprint in the mud and, perhaps, the first whisper of a secret that would one day shake the town to its core. This was not just the story of a forgotten child. It was the story of a life that had been written in shadows, a tale of resilience and mystery, and a journey that would force everyone who thought they had understood him to reckon with the extraordinary hidden beneath the ordinary. But before we continue this story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. The boy had grown up in an orphanage that stood at the edge of town, its brick walls etched with decades of neglect. The children inside were accustomed to being overlooked, shuffled from one caretaker to another, and left to find solace in their imaginations. Yet even among them he was different, not because of his appearance. He was slight and pale, with eyes that seemed too old for his face, but because of the quiet way he observed the world. While other children played or cried or bickered over the smallest scraps of attention, he would sit in corners, tracing patterns in the dust on the floor, listening to the faintest sounds of the old building. The drip of water from a leaking pipe, the groan of wooden floorboards under the weight of footsteps long gone, the whisper of wind through a broken window pane. To the casual observer, he was nothing more than another abandoned child. Yet in his silence was a patience and awareness that suggested he understood things no one else could. The orphanage itself had a history that the townspeople preferred to forget. Built in the late 1800s by a philanthropic but reclusive industrialist, it had once been a place of hope, a sanctuary for children who had lost their families to disease or misfortune. By the time the boy arrived, the building had become a relic of faded intentions, its walls cracking under years of rain and wind, its hallways echoing with memories that had long since decayed. Staff members treated the children with detached routine, providing the bare minimum of care. Meals were predictable, beds were hard, and affection was rare. Yet in these conditions, the boy learned to survive not through confrontation or deceit, but through observation, reflection, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the rhythms of the world around him. He noticed how the matron's mood shifted with the change of seasons, how certain floors groaned differently depending on the time of day, and even how the wind carried messages if one only listened closely enough. It was as though he had learned to read the hidden patterns of life, to find signals in a world that most people treated as noise. As he grew older, the other children began to see him not just as quiet, but as strange. They whispered behind his back, calling him names that echoed his isolation: the ghost, the shadow, the one who sees too much. And yet he bore their ridicule without anger or protest. He understood something fundamental that they did not. Survival was not about winning attention, but about knowing when to move, when to speak, and most importantly, when to remain unseen. In a place where affection was scarce and cruelty common, he had mastered the art of invisibility. Yet beneath that stillness, a storm was quietly building. The boy had a secret, a talent, or perhaps a burden, that set him apart from every other child who had ever passed through the orphanage's worn doors. It was a secret he could not share, not because he was afraid, but because he knew the world was not ready for it. He could manipulate small events in ways that seemed impossible, alter outcomes that others believed were predetermined, and read the intentions of people before they themselves fully understood them. It was subtle at first, a misplaced object returned to its rightful owner, a whispered warning that prevented a fall. But as the years passed, The scope of his ability grew more pronounced, more undeniable. Even so, he remained patient. He had learned that power without discretion invited fear, suspicion, and sometimes violence. In the orphanage, he practiced small experiments, testing boundaries, watching reactions. He learned to blend into the backdrop of the world, appearing nothing more than an ordinary boy to those who failed to pay attention. And yet, as he moved through the halls, leaving trails of subtle influence in his wake, there were moments when the staff and other children caught glimpses of his extraordinary insight. A matron once remarked, decades too late, that he always seemed to know what you were thinking before you did, though at the time, she dismissed it as coincidence or the overactive imagination of children. Outside the orphanage, the town had its own rhythms, indifferent to the lives of the abandoned children within its walls. Markets bustled, smoke rose from chimneys, and church bells punctuated the passage of time. The boy would wander through the streets during brief moments of freedom, observing the lives of those who took for granted what he could only imagine. He saw merchants cheating customers, lovers quarreling over trivial slights, and families shielding painful truths behind polite smiles. He catalogued it all, storing memories and insights like treasures in a hidden chest, knowing that one day this knowledge might serve a purpose far beyond mere survival. Yet, for all his observation and subtle influence, there was a loneliness that the boy could not evade. Friendship, trust, and love were commodities he had never been granted. When other children played together, they did so in clusters, exchanging secrets and forming bonds he could only watch from the edges. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would climb to the roof of the orphanage and gaze at the stars, imagining lives where he belonged, where his secret might be celebrated rather than feared. The sky became a canvas for his longing, a place where the invisible threads of destiny seemed to shimmer, teasing him with the promise of something greater. The turning point came one winter, when a new headmaster arrived at the orphanage. Unlike his predecessors, this man was not content to administer the building with detached routine. He sought order, excellence, and above all, results. He introduced tests, schedules, and expectations that pushed the children beyond their accustomed limits. For the first time, the boy's abilities became both a tool and a threat. He could navigate these demands effortlessly, anticipate the challenges, and emerge unscathed where others faltered. But the headmaster, keenly observant and unaccustomed to being bested, began to notice anomalies, objects mysteriously in place, predictions that came true with unsettling accuracy, and a child whose presence seemed to alter the very flow of events. It was during a particularly harsh January storm that the boy's secret first became undeniable. A fire broke out in the west wing of the orphanage and panic erupted among the children and staff. Chaos reigned, and yet, moving silently and deliberately, he guided several children to safety through routes that no one else had considered, shutting doors to slow the spread of flames, signaling for help with gestures only a few could interpret. By the time the fire was extinguished, the orphanage had suffered damage, but lives were saved. The headmaster, standing amidst the smoke and ruin, realized with a mixture of awe and fear that the boy was unlike any child he had ever encountered. Word spread slowly through the town. Stories began to circulate about the boy who seemed to see the future, to manipulate chance, to perform feats that defied explanation. Some whispered that he was blessed, others claimed he was cursed. And while the townspeople debated and speculated, the boy remained exactly as he had always been, quiet, watchful, waiting. He understood that revelation carried risk, that the world was not yet ready for him, and yet, deep down, he sensed that the time would come when he could no longer remain in the shadows. As he walked home that evening, the firelight reflecting in puddles on the cobblestones, he felt the first stirrings of destiny. For years he had endured neglect, obscurity, and the casual cruelty of a world that overlooked the powerless. But now, with a single act, he had begun to alter the narrative of his life, shifting it from one of passive survival to active transformation. He did not yet know what form this transformation would take, but for the first time, he felt the exhilarating, terrifying truth that his secret was no longer just his own, and that the world might never see him the same way again. Winter had left the town exhausted. Streets were lined with the remnants of frost, the gutters still carrying slush from days before, and the orphanage itself smelled of damp wood and smoke from makeshift fires. Yet for the boy, Winter was never merely a season. It was a teacher, a canvas for observation, and a stage where his secret could unfold in subtle ways. Since the fire incident, the staff had watched him differently. The headmaster, once distant and indifferent, now studied him with a mixture of admiration and unease, as if every movement the boy made might be a signal, a prophecy, or a warning. And though the boy understood the scrutiny, he continued as he always had, quiet, deliberate, unassuming, never giving more than he wished to reveal. Life inside the orphanage adjusted to the new reality. Children who had previously ignored him now stole curious glances, some even attempting to engage, though hesitantly, as if testing waters they did not understand. The boy welcomed no friendships, offered no answers, and yet through his presence, he altered the rhythms of the place. Meals seemed to arrive just in time. Arguments dissipated before they escalated, and lost objects found their way to rightful owners. Staff whispered about luck or divine favor, though neither truly understood the mechanism behind the phenomena. In his mind, the boy cataloged every interaction, every subtle shift, for he knew that patterns of human behavior were as predictable as the rise and fall of tides, if one observed carefully enough. One afternoon, as gray clouds gathered over the orphanage, a letter arrived addressed to the headmaster. Its envelope was thick, bearing the seal of an old law firm. Inside was a single sheet of paper, elegantly typed, outlining a proposition that seemed almost too precise to be coincidental. A wealthy benefactor had taken interest in one of the children, offering opportunities beyond the orphanage's limits, but only if the child possessed certain unique qualities. The headmaster read it aloud to the staff, his voice a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The room seemed to hold its breath, aware that an ordinary child could never be the intended recipient. All eyes inevitably fell upon the boy, whose pale face betrayed nothing, though a spark of comprehension flickered in his eyes. That night, as the orphanage settled into uneasy sleep, the boy climbed to his usual rooftop vantage point, staring at the distant lights of the town that shimmered beneath the storm-threatened sky. He thought about the letter, about opportunity, and about the heavy weight of decisions that lay ahead. For years he had mastered invisibility, blending seamlessly into the margins of life, observing and influencing in small, almost imperceptible ways. Yet now, an external force threatened to pull him into the spotlight. He was no longer simply a survivor. He was a contender in a game far larger than any he had previously imagined. The following days were a delicate dance. The benefactor's representatives arrived, careful, deliberate, and almost imperceptibly intimidating. They asked questions, measured reactions, and observed interactions among the children. While others faltered under scrutiny, the boy moved with fluid assurance. A toy misplaced on a shelf, a door left ajar, a subtle gesture from a nervous child. All became opportunities for him to display his intuitive understanding without overtly revealing his abilities. The adults, unaware of the underlying intelligence and control guiding these seemingly mundane events, were impressed. They commented on his poise, his attentiveness, his uncanny ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed. Yet they could not fathom the truth, that every action he took, every glance he cast was calculated, informed by an almost preternatural insight into the mechanics of cause and effect. Word spread slowly, but inevitably, that the orphan who had been overlooked for years was now the subject of extraordinary attention. Children who had mocked or ignored him now watched with a mixture of envy and awe. Staff members whispered, debating whether his behavior was miraculous, luck, or some hidden cunning. Even the headmaster, whose skepticism had been tempered by the events of the fire, found himself caught between fascination and fear. For in the boy's calm demeanor, there lay a potential that was at once inspiring and unsettling. It was as if the universe had compressed a lifetime of understanding into the body of a child. Despite the growing attention, the boy remained cautious. He had learned the dangers of exposure. Power, even subtle power, invited envy, fear, and sometimes violence. In the orphanage, where human emotions were raw and unrefined, these forces were particularly potent. So he continued to act in ways that were almost imperceptible, guiding outcomes with a gentle touch, always maintaining the illusion of ordinary existence. The benefactor's representatives, for all their sophistication, never suspected the true extent of his abilities. They saw what they wanted to see, a polite, intelligent, observant child, and were eager to claim him as the ideal candidate for their proposed program. It was during a winter festival in the town square that the boy's abilities first intersected with public life. Snow had begun to fall in delicate feathery patterns, dusting the cobblestones and lampposts. Merchants displayed their wares beneath bright, swinging lanterns, and children laughed, chasing each other through the crowded streets. Among them, the boy moved silently, unnoticed, as he always preferred. Yet his influence began to ripple outward. A falling stall was steadied just before it collapsed. A frightened child avoided injury through an instinctive step guided by his subtle gestures, and a lost purse found its way back to its owner. Observers might have called it luck, divine intervention, or coincidence, but those who understood the boy's presence recognized a different truth. An unseen hand had shaped events in the space of a few moments, turning potential disaster into quiet triumph. That night, back at the orphanage, the boy contemplated the implications, the attention of the benefactor, the subtle acknowledgement of townspeople, and the whispers of staff combined to form a new reality. He was no longer invisible, and the notion of anonymity, the comfort of existing in shadows, was slipping away. The boy knew that once his secret was revealed, fully or partially, life would change irreversibly. Opportunities and dangers, admiration and fear, acceptance and rejection, all hung in delicate balance. Yet he also understood that inaction would leave him confined to the margins forever. A life of survival without influence, of existence without recognition. The first test came sooner than he expected. One evening, while walking along the frost-glazed streets, he encountered a small group of local boys who had previously tormented him. They blocked his path, laughter sharp and cruel, as if testing whether he had the courage to resist. The boy's mind moved faster than any reaction, analyzing motives, predicting movements, calculating probabilities. Within seconds, he had diffused the confrontation without a single strike. A subtle glance, a shift in posture, an almost imperceptible step guided the group's attention elsewhere. The boys, confused but unharmed, dispersed, leaving him standing alone. In that moment, he realized that his secret, though still concealed, had begun to manifest in public ways. He was learning not only to survive but to assert control, to shape events with subtle precision, and to navigate the complexities of human behavior without betraying his true capabilities. Back at the orphanage, discussions about the benefactor intensified. Plans were made, schedules adjusted, and forms prepared. The boy observed every conversation with meticulous care, noting who spoke first, whose opinions carried weight, and how decisions were made. For him, this was not merely academic. It was survival, strategy, and preparation for the moment when revelation would be inevitable. Each interaction, each observation, was a piece of a puzzle that, once assembled, would allow him to claim his place in a world that had long ignored him. Yet even as he strategized, the boy never lost sight of the human element. He understood fear, desire, hope, and grief in ways that adults often fail to recognize. When another child cried in the night, it was not inconvenience but suffering he felt. When the matron grew weary and harsh, he observed not just discipline but the weight of her own hidden frustrations. In all these interactions, he practiced empathy, testing how influence could coexist with care, how power could be wielded without cruelty. This balance, he knew, would define not only how the world saw him, but how he saw himself. As winter slowly gave way to the tentative signs of spring, the boy began to sense the edges of destiny tightening around him. Opportunities, challenges, and revelations loomed on the horizon. His secret, carefully nurtured and concealed for years, was no longer a purely private tool. It had become a bridge, a potential that could transform both his life and the lives of those around him. The orphan no one wanted, the shadow among shadows, had begun to step into the light, and the world was on the cusp of understanding that nothing, and no one, was ever as simple as it seemed. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, brushing the edges of the town with hints of green and sunlight, yet the orphan remained largely untouched by its warmth. Inside the orphanage, the seasons changed, but the rhythms of life were relentless. Chores, lessons, strict schedules, and the muted echo of forgotten laughter. But for the boy, spring was more than a calendar. It was a herald, a subtle signal that change was approaching. The letter from the benefactor had not gone away. It lingered in the back of his mind like a quiet drumbeat, a reminder that opportunity was no longer a distant concept but a tangible possibility. And yet, with the promise of advancement came an equal measure of risk. Secrets, once exposed, were rarely forgiving. The boy began to test the boundaries of his abilities more openly, though always cautiously. A broken cart on the town square was diverted without anyone seeing how. A falling lantern stabilized by an unseen nudge. A frantic merchant's lost money returned to his pocket before he realized it had gone missing. Observers whispered, shocked at what seemed like luck or divine intervention. But to the boy, it was merely practice, an exercise in precision, control, and patience. Every action had consequence. Every small influence was a rehearsal for the inevitable revelation that lay ahead. The headmaster, now fully aware that something extraordinary resided within the boy, grew both protective and anxious. He sought counsel from the benefactor's representatives, discussing methods of evaluation, ways to observe the child without alarming him, and the timing of introducing him to opportunities beyond the orphanage. Yet the boy, attuned to human patterns, anticipated every step. He understood their intentions, their assumptions, and even the subtle fears that guided their decisions. In essence, he was always a few moves ahead, silent, unseen, and unfathomably aware. One afternoon, a visitor arrived whose presence would alter the trajectory of the boy's life more than any letter or meeting ever could. She was a woman of striking presence, neither overly imposing nor unapproachably distant, with eyes that seemed to scan the world not for what it was but for what it concealed. She claimed to be a scholar of human potential, drawn to the town by rumors of a child who defied ordinary explanation. Staff members, wary yet intrigued, introduced her to the boy in a controlled environment, a small library room, dust motes floating in shafts of sunlight through tall, narrow windows, the scent of old paper and wood pervasive. The boy observed her as he always did, noting posture, gaze, breathing, and subtle shifts in expression. Within moments he discerned her curiosity, skepticism, and the careful armor she wore to hide uncertainty. She did not ask him to perform any feats, nor did she offer overt compliments or praise. Yet her attention was focused, deliberate, and unblinking. It was the first time someone approached him with a combination of insight and caution that matched in part his own. He recognized a kindred mind, someone who might perceive the truth before it could be hidden. Over the following weeks, sessions with the scholar became a ritual. She posed puzzles, moral dilemmas, and hypothetical scenarios, observing not just his answers, but the manner in which he arrived at them. He responded with subtlety, often allowing her to believe she had influenced his choices, while in truth he had guided the outcomes to reveal as little or as much as he wished. Slowly, deliberately, he began to trust her presence, not with friendship, not with affection. Those were luxuries he had never known, but with understanding. She did not demand performance. She observed and reflected, allowing the boy to exercise his abilities in an environment that was both controlled and authentic. The pivotal moment, however, came unexpectedly during a town council meeting. The representatives of the benefactor had arranged a formal demonstration under the guise of an intelligence evaluation. Officials, merchants, and townspeople were present, each curious, skeptical, and eager to witness what was being touted as an extraordinary display of capability. The boy entered the room quietly, his posture unassuming, his gaze steady. As the exercises commenced, it became clear that this was more than intelligence testing. This was observation of influence, pattern recognition, and problem-solving under pressure. At first, his actions were subtle. A pen left on the wrong side of a desk corrected itself before anyone noticed. A distracted council member was guided to a crucial document at the precise moment it was needed. A potentially embarrassing misstatement was preemptively avoided, as if the room itself had conspired to maintain order. To observers, these occurrences seemed like luck, coincidence, or perhaps an uncanny intuition. But by the end of the session, the cumulative effect was undeniable. The boy had orchestrated an entire series of events with precision, grace, and foresight that no ordinary mind could achieve. Murmurs swept the room. Officials leaned forward, whispers filled corners, and even the skeptics began to question the boundaries of reality. Yet it was not sheer spectacle that defined his reveal. It was the way he wielded influence with subtlety and restraint. He could have dominated the demonstration, turned it into a show of power, or humiliated those who doubted him. Instead, he chose to guide, to correct, and to reveal only as much as was necessary. In doing so, he maintained a veneer of innocence, a guise that allowed the audience to admire without fear, to wonder without suspicion. For the boy understood an essential truth: revelation without control breeds chaos. Power without discretion invites resistance. The aftermath of the meeting transformed the boy's world. Letters arrived from the benefactor, offering opportunities beyond imagination, advanced education, mentorship by scholars, and exposure to circles of influence previously inconceivable. Yet with these opportunities came profound questions of identity and loyalty. Could he leave the orphanage, the only home he had ever known, for a world that demanded excellence but offered uncertainty? Could he wield his abilities responsibly in a society that had neither understood nor valued subtle genius until now? And perhaps most critically, could he remain true to himself while navigating the expectations, fears, and ambitions of those who would now scrutinize every move? Amid this whirlwind, the boy's relationships within the orphanage shifted in unexpected ways. Children who once ignored or mocked him now sought his guidance, drawn by curiosity, admiration, and fear. Staff members treated him with deference, unsure whether to approach as mentor, guardian, or observer. Even the headmaster, whose early skepticism had hardened into cautious respect, found himself relying upon the boy's insights in subtle matters of administration and conflict resolution. In every corner of his immediate world, the boy's presence had transformed the dynamics of interaction. Yet he remained cautious, mindful of the delicate balance between influence and exposure, between guidance and overreach. It was during a quiet evening, as he walked alone along the riverbank, that he began to comprehend the magnitude of his secret. The water reflected the first glow of twilight, rippling with motion yet mirroring an order invisible to casual observation. In that reflection, he saw a metaphor for himself, seemingly ordinary on the surface, yet beneath lay currents of control, awareness, and potential that could shape outcomes far beyond expectation. He realized that his life was no longer simply about survival or observation. It was about stewardship. He possessed the means to influence, to guide, and to shape the world around him. But with that power came responsibility, moral choice, and the burden of foresight. The scholar who had visited weeks before returned at this moment, sensing the boy's contemplation. She did not interrupt, did not question, but merely observed him silently, allowing him to confront the immensity of his own abilities. He understood that she recognized his internal struggle, not as a child wrestling with identity, but as a mind confronting potential. He could reveal himself entirely to her, trust her with the magnitude of his secret, and perhaps gain the guidance necessary to navigate the uncharted path before him. And yet he hesitated, for revelation, even to those he trusted, carried irrevocable consequences. Once the secret was out, the world would no longer allow shadows. Anonymity would be gone, and he would be subject to scrutiny, expectation, and perhaps exploitation. Days turned into weeks, and the opportunities offered by the benefactor's representatives pressed closer. The boy, weighing risk and reward, began to make decisions that would define his trajectory. Small acts of intervention became increasingly deliberate, guiding the orphanage children to safety, influencing town events to prevent harm, and subtly shaping outcomes to demonstrate capability without revealing mechanism. His secret, once entirely private, was now an open question. When and how would he fully reveal it? To whom could he reveal it safely? And what would it cost him, emotionally, socially, and morally, to do so? In the quiet of one late spring evening, he finally made a choice. He would reveal a fragment of his secret, sufficient to demonstrate the extraordinary without exposing all his methods. At the annual town festival, amidst lanterns, music, and laughter, he orchestrated an event that would capture the imagination of all present. A young child about to fall into the frozen fountain was guided to safety without a hand touching them. A series of small accidents were averted, and a moment of potential disaster became an unforgettable display of grace and control. The crowd erupted in wonder, whispers turning to exclamations. The scholar, observing from the sidelines, smiled subtly, recognizing the deliberate control and judgment inherent in the display. That night, as the boy returned to the orphanage, he understood that nothing would ever be the same. He had stepped into the light, revealed a portion of his secret, and altered the perception of himself in the eyes of those around him. He had become a figure of fascination, hope, and uncertainty, a child whose potential could inspire, challenge, and perhaps intimidate. The orphan no one wanted was now the boy whose abilities demanded recognition, whose secret could no longer remain entirely hidden, and whose journey into a world that had long ignored him was only beginning. Summer had arrived with an intensity that seemed to press down upon the town like an invisible weight. The streets shimmered under the afternoon sun, heat rising in waves from the cobblestones, and the orphanage's brick walls absorbed and radiated that heat, making the interior feel both oppressive and alive. For most, it was a season of labor, festivals, and languid days. For the boy, however, summer brought something far more intricate: consequences. The fragment of his secret revealed at the spring festival had begun to ripple outward, affecting lives, perceptions, and the very fabric of the town. Whispers traveled faster than wind. Speculation replaced curiosity, and admiration mingled uneasily with fear. The boy, ever observant, noted each subtle shift: the quickened glance, the hesitation before conversation, the way adults now measured his presence before speaking. Within the orphanage, the change was equally profound. Children once indifferent or even hostile toward him now oscillated between awe and suspicion. Some sought his guidance in small matters: where to hide during games, how to navigate the town without trouble. But even in their requests, there was a latent tension. They wanted to admire him, emulate him, and perhaps belong to his influence, yet simultaneously, they feared what he might do if displeased. Staff members, too, were cautious. The headmaster, now fully aware of the extraordinary child in his care, struggled with the dual role of mentor and protector. How could he guide a boy whose abilities far exceeded his understanding without enabling danger, exploitation, or chaos? Every decision was a balancing act, measured in both immediate consequences and potential long-term outcomes. The benefactor's representatives pressed their offer more urgently. Letters arrived with meticulous language, outlining scholarships, exclusive mentorships, and educational opportunities far beyond the scope of the orphanage. Yet these letters carried subtle undertones, a quiet insistence that the boy's abilities be directed toward objectives predetermined by adults who wielded influence and power. The boy, now acutely aware of both opportunity and risk, weighed each proposition carefully. To accept blindly was to surrender control. To reject overtly might close doors permanently. He understood that his secret, the very thing that elevated him above ordinary children, could also become a chain if mismanaged. It was during a particularly stifling afternoon that the first true test of responsibility arrived. A fire broke out, not in the orphanage, but in a section of the town market, fueled by overturned barrels of oil in dry wooden stalls. Panic spread instantly. Merchants shouted, children cried, and townspeople scrambled. Unlike previous minor disturbances, this situation demanded more than subtle guidance. It required decisive action. The boy, moving with silent deliberation, orchestrated a sequence of interventions. A merchant's ladder was subtly shifted to block falling debris. A small child's stumble was corrected by a tiny redirection of attention. A stack of burning crates was nudged into an empty alleyway. To observers, these acts appeared as luck, instinct, or coincidence. Yet by the time the fire was controlled, several lives had been spared and property damage minimized. The aftermath was chaotic, a mixture of gratitude and whispered speculation. Officials noted the boy's presence at every key juncture, though no one could fully articulate how he had guided events so flawlessly. Among townspeople, stories began to circulate of a child who could manipulate fate, who seemed to anticipate danger before it arrived, and whose quiet actions concealed power that no one could quantify. The orphanage staff, witnessing the boy's orchestration, were both awed and fearful. For the first time, it became clear that his secret was no longer a fragment. It was a force capable of reshaping reality, and with such power came the unspoken question: what would he do next? In the following days, the town's dynamics shifted noticeably. Children followed his suggestions with a mixture of respect and hesitation. Merchants adjusted their routines in deference to his presence. Adults spoke of him with awe, caution, and in some cases, envy. The boy, ever patient and observant, documented each reaction, each ripple of influence, understanding that social patterns could be as predictable and manipulable as physical events. He was learning not only to wield his abilities but also to navigate the complex network of human psychology, a discipline far more intricate than any manipulation of objects or small events. Amid this growing attention, the scholar returned. She had been absent for several months, pursuing research and following rumors of the boy's evolving capabilities. Her arrival was quiet yet deliberate, her presence immediately sensed by the boy. Unlike the benefactor's representatives or the headmaster, she did not approach with expectation or presumption. She observed, listened, and allowed the boy to guide interactions subtly, testing both his skills and his judgment. Over long conversations, often in the dim glow of the orphanage's library, they discussed not only abilities and tactics, but ethics and responsibility. She challenged him. If one possesses the power to shape outcomes, to influence decisions, and to avert danger, how does one determine the proper use of that power? To whom does one owe allegiance, and at what cost does control become obsession? These questions weighed heavily on the boy. He realized that his secret was no longer merely a tool of survival or demonstration. It was a lens through which morality, loyalty, and self-identity were refracted. The ability to manipulate events carried implications far beyond immediate outcomes. It shaped perception, trust, and destiny. Misuse could inspire fear, dependence, or resentment. Even minor mistakes, subtle miscalculations, could have cascading consequences. The scholar's probing questions forced him to confront these realities, to consider not only the mechanics of influence, but the ethics of responsibility. Conflict arose unexpectedly. A faction of town officials, skeptical of the boy's capabilities, began to challenge his influence. They questioned reports, sought evidence of manipulation, and subtly tested his abilities under controlled observation. The boy, attuned to both intention and suspicion, responded with subtlety. He redirected conversations, influenced decisions without overt interference, and ensured that outcomes aligned with his desire to maintain order and safety. Yet the challenge illuminated a harsh truth. Power invites scrutiny, and visibility, once embraced, cannot be fully controlled. The boy's secret, once private, now existed in a delicate balance between revelation and concealment. Meanwhile, the orphanage children reacted in unexpected ways. Some were inspired, following his example in small, innovative ways, demonstrating that his influence extended beyond immediate intervention to subtle modeling of behavior. Others, envious or fearful, began to test boundaries, seeking to provoke errors or discover the limits of his abilities. The boy recognized these patterns, guiding them quietly, correcting misbehavior with minimal confrontation, and teaching lessons in patience, observation, and consequence. His interactions were never punitive, yet always precise, a demonstration that mastery of influence required restraint, foresight, and ethical consideration. Amid these layers of complexity, the benefactor renewed their offer with urgency. They emphasized potential, prestige, and opportunity, yet implied that his abilities should be aligned with predetermined objectives. Letters, messages, and visits created a constant pressure, a reminder that while the boy could navigate and influence his immediate environment, the broader world was impatient and demanding. He now faced a choice with real consequences: to accept an externally defined path of opportunity, or to assert autonomy over the trajectory of his life, risking alienation, failure, and exposure. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting elongated shadows across the orphanage courtyard, the boy confronted a personal truth. He had guided, influenced, and subtly shaped outcomes for years, but never fully revealed the breadth of his secret. To do so would invite scrutiny, admiration, and perhaps fear, but also liberation. His abilities could no longer remain partially hidden. The magnitude of opportunity, responsibility, and consequence demanded visibility. In the reflection of the darkening windows, he saw not only his own pale face, but the reflection of potential, the power to shape the world around him, balanced precariously with the need for ethical control. The scholar, observing from a distance, noted this internal reckoning. She recognized that the boy was approaching a threshold, a point at which decision, courage, and self-awareness would converge. The path forward required both strategic calculation and moral clarity. In her presence, he had found the rare combination of understanding, challenge, and guidance necessary to prepare for what lay ahead. The world outside was vast, unpredictable, and relentless. Yet for the first time, he felt the subtle thrill of readiness, a quiet confidence that the secret he had guarded for years could now serve a purpose beyond mere survival. And so, as summer deepened, the orphan no one wanted began the deliberate, patient, and courageous process of claiming his place. The town, still adjusting to the revelations of his abilities, watched and speculated, while the boy navigated influence, responsibility, and moral choice with precision and care. Every interaction, every decision, every subtle intervention was both an exercise in skill and a preparation for the inevitable, the moment when his full secret would intersect with opportunity, challenge, and destiny in a way that could reshape not only his life, but the lives of all who had long overlooked him. Autumn arrived with a quiet inevitability, painting the town in muted golds and deep ambers. Leaves fell in deliberate spirals, drifting lazily across the cobblestones, echoing the passage of time with a soft, almost musical rustle. The orphan, now no longer just a boy in shadows, walked through the streets with a purpose that was unmistakable, yet unassuming. The summer's trials, the fire, the festival, the scrutiny of townspeople, and the interventions he had orchestrated, all of it had led to this moment. The secret he had guarded for years, nurtured in silence and patience, was poised to emerge fully, irrevocably altering the lives of everyone around him. It began at the orphanage, in the early morning light when the boy gathered the staff and children in the main hall. He did not announce a display, nor did he seek applause. Instead, he spoke simply, his voice calm yet resonant, carrying the weight of experience and insight far beyond his years. He explained not only what he had done in subtle interventions, but why. He spoke of observation, foresight, consequence, and choice. Every action he had taken, guiding, preventing harm, influencing events, was deliberate, informed by the understanding that his abilities were a responsibility, not merely a gift. Eyes widened, murmurs rose and fell like waves. Shock, awe, and disbelief mixed with a hesitant respect. Here was the orphan no one wanted, revealing not only extraordinary ability, but also profound moral clarity. The scholar, standing slightly apart, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. She had known, perhaps better than anyone, that the boy possessed potential that could reshape the world around him. Yet even she had been unprepared for the totality of what he revealed. The meticulous control over probability, the precise influence on human decisions, the foresight that allowed him to orchestrate outcomes without detection, and the wisdom with which he had tempered power with restraint. The secret was no longer a fragment, a hidden skill exercised in silence. It was a complete force, a conscious shaping of reality in both tangible and intangible ways. Outside, the town had begun to gather. Word traveled fast. The extraordinary had been glimpsed and now demanded attention. Merchants, officials, townspeople, and even distant observers arrived, curious to witness the orphan whose subtle influence had become legend. They expected spectacle, perhaps magic, perhaps a trick of luck, but what they saw was far more profound. Deliberate, conscious orchestration of events guided by intelligence, empathy, and ethical judgment. A minor accident was prevented, a lost child safely guided home, disputes resolved before anger could ignite. Every intervention was precise, quiet, and profoundly human. It was a revelation that combined wonder with comprehension, showing that true power was as much about judgment as ability. In the crowd, some were inspired, others fearful, and a few envious. Debate erupted in whispers. Was he blessed, cursed, or simply something beyond comprehension? The boy, however, remained composed. He understood that reaction was part of the pattern, that human perception could be as malleable as circumstance itself. He had revealed his secret, not to dominate, but to educate, to guide, and to demonstrate that extraordinary ability need not come at the cost of humanity. This was the culmination of years of observation, reflection, and quiet rehearsal, a deliberate emergence from shadow into light, balanced with ethical clarity. The benefactor's representatives stepped forward, awed yet cautious. They offered opportunities that dwarfed the confines of the town, access to elite education, mentorship with thinkers and innovators, and resources to explore and cultivate his abilities fully. Yet for the first time, the boy considered the possibility of autonomy over imposed opportunity. He could follow the path they outlined, guided by expectation, or he could carve his own course, shaping not only personal destiny but potentially influencing the broader society through deliberate, ethical intervention. The choice weighed heavily, for with revelation came not just opportunity, but responsibility on a scale previously unimaginable. It was the scholar who reminded him of a principle he had already known, but had perhaps not fully articulated: that the measure of power is not in display, nor in admiration, but in the ability to choose wisely, act ethically, and accept consequence. The boy realized then that his secret had always been more than a skill. It was a covenant with the world. He could not act recklessly, nor could he hide forever. To wield influence responsibly required courage, restraint, and vision. And so, after a long, contemplative silence, he made his decision. He would embrace his potential fully, not as a spectacle, not as a tool for others' ambition, but as an agent of change guided by conscience. He would accept mentorship and opportunity, but on terms defined by his own judgment. He would continue to observe, influence, and guide, always with subtlety, always with empathy, and always mindful of consequence. In that choice, he claimed not only his secret but his identity. The orphan no one wanted had become a figure of authority, wisdom, and extraordinary insight, not through birthright, wealth, or privilege, but through patience, observation, and ethical mastery of his abilities. The town, having witnessed the culmination of years of subtle orchestration, slowly absorbed the significance. Fear gave way to awe, skepticism to respect, and curiosity to cautious understanding. Merchants, officials, and neighbors realized that the boy was no ordinary child. He was a mind capable of perceiving and guiding reality with a clarity and restraint that demanded recognition. Yet the boy did not revel in admiration. He continued to move quietly through the streets, blending subtle influence with everyday life, demonstrating that true mastery lies not in spectacle, but in quiet, ethical, and effective guidance. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon and the sky blazed with colors of amber and violet, the boy climbed to his familiar rooftop. The scholar joined him, silently observing the panorama of the town below. In the fading light, the boy reflected on the journey, from abandonment and neglect to revelation and recognition, from shadows to subtle power, from survival to moral mastery. He had navigated fear, isolation, opportunity, and consequence. He had revealed his secret without arrogance, influenced without coercion, and grown in wisdom alongside ability. He understood, finally, that life would never allow him anonymity again, and perhaps that was as it should be. Secrets carry power, but revelation carries responsibility. He had mastered both. The town, the orphanage, and even the wider world were now part of the delicate web he would influence, not as a tyrant, not as a magician, but as a guardian of possibility, a steward of outcome, and a child whose extraordinary insight had transformed him from one who was unwanted into one whose presence could not be ignored. As night fell and stars emerged, reflected in the river and glimmering across the rooftops, the boy knew that his journey was only beginning. The secret had been revealed, but its implications were infinite. Lives would intersect, choices would ripple, and the balance between power and responsibility would remain a perpetual challenge. Yet he faced it not with fear, but with calm purpose. The quiet confidence of one who had long observed the world, understood it, and finally claimed a place within it. In the end, the orphan no one wanted had become the boy everyone would remember, not because of spectacle, wealth, or title, but because he had revealed a secret that transcended ordinary understanding, that true power is invisible, deliberate, and most profoundly expressed in wisdom, empathy, and choice. The story of the child who emerged from shadows would linger in the town for generations, a reminder that extraordinary ability, tempered by conscience, can transform not only one life but the fabric of a community itself. And so, beneath the quiet canopy of night, with the river reflecting the infinite possibilities of the future, the boy, no longer invisible, no longer ordinary, continued his journey, fully aware of the weight, wonder, and responsibility of his revealed secret. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.